Greetings to everyone here in this room. It is a real pleasure to have you all here. With me today is Glenn Carle. Glenn Carle retired as Deputy National Intelligence Officer. He was the head of the Office of Transnational Threats. He had a long and illustrious career in the CIA. Some would say the dreaded CIA, some would say the infamous CIA. Glenn is an author, Glenn is a geopolitical analyst, Glenn is also a senior partner at Fair Observer Intelligence, along with Vikram Sood, who retired as chief of RAW, India's version of CIA. Now, on behalf of Fair Observer and IIT Gandhinagar, I'm welcoming Glenn. Please give him a big hand. Let's get to the meat of the matter now. The warm-up session has ended. You are a CIA man, a rather well-known CIA man. How did you end up in the CIA?
Well, this is a challenge because I'm long-winded, so I'll try to be concise. As you've already heard, I was born in Boston, grew up in Boston, and then I had always thought as a secondary student, as a 17-year-old, that half of one's, or a big part of one's university education was going away, seeing something different. I like Boston, but the world is a big place, and I don't only want to know Boston. So I was determined to leave Boston for my education. And my mother said, well, Glenn, you should really apply. You're a good student. You should apply to Harvard. There's no better place than Harvard. I said, no, I'm not going to go to Harvard. I won't do it. It's in Boston. I refuse. And I refused to go anyway because that's where everybody goes, and so I don't want to do what everybody does. And she said, well, I think you should think about it. So I did apply, and I was accepted. And when I thought about it's hard to say no to Harvard because Harvard really is an outstanding university. And so that's where I went. And because but the university, I measured this precisely. Where I lived at Harvard was precisely 5 kilometers from my home. There were 2 routes, and both of them it was 5 kilometers. So I used to jog home once every 6 weeks or so with my laundry bag. I either had a lot of clothes or was very dirty, but I would jog home. It's too close. I wanted to see something else. So I'm glad that somebody got my witticism. Thank you very much. And I had also always wanted to learn a foreign language. And my parents had chosen, actually my mother, had chosen French as the language I would study when I was young. So that's the only foreign language I knew at all. So if I want to go away someplace else and I want to learn a foreign language, where do you go? I mean, you go to France. I love school. I didn't want to miss school. So I took a year off, something that was very unusual in the early 1970s. It wasn't done really a lot. You could drop out, but that's a whole different thing. And I went to France, and I worked on a farm with peasants, and I had never met a peasant coming from an upper middle class existence. And I fell in love with France, things foreign, and was directed towards an internationally oriented life by my interest. My father had been involved very much in public service and had raised us, my brother and me, to believe that unless you in some way engaged with your community, you were really not a good person because you were then acting only for yourself. And by definition, to act only for yourself is selfish, and selfishness is almost the ultimate evil. So public service is important, and I thought, how do you combine a love with things foreign and French with an interest in public service and a compulsion to engage in public service? And I thought, I know, the Foreign Service, which is our diplomatic corps. And so that's what I started to pursue. There are many twists and turns. It takes a long time. It's extremely competitive to get in. And as I was pursuing that, life had to go on, and I had some, as I think all of us probably do, some setbacks and confusion because I was struggling with the Conrad question about how to find meaning and what to do with myself. And so at a moment when I was particularly confused, I thought, well, what could be the most challenging thing I can possibly do intellectually, morally, and maybe even physically, because I was very athletic. And I thought, I know, being a spy, it must be wild. I'll try that.
You watched too many James Bond movies, did you?
Well, no one knows what espionage is like. All any of us know is James Bond and whatever the contemporary things are. I don't know the names of the movie spies, but that's all anyone knows. And so I thought, I'll try that. So I approached the Career Services Office at Harvard. I knew some people there, and I said, how do you contact the CIA? Because there was no internet, and the CIA is secret. So how do you contact them? But I assumed that, I was certain that the Harvard Career Services Office would know. And so the woman who I was speaking to was a very good friend. And I said, how do you contact the CIA? And she did this. This is true. She picked up a pencil from her desk or a pen, and she went, by calling that number, Glenn. So I did.
So they recruited from the CIA. The career lady was a spotter for the CIA.
No, that used to be true. That was true before my day. That was true in the 50s and the early 60s. By the time I was in the 70s, late 70s, when I asked that question, it was actually not true
Only
any
those
longer.
who asked.
But they knew. Yeah, they couldn't legally do what they had done before. But they still had how to contact. And so I contacted them.
So they had the private number of the chief or someone like that.
And I went, the office, the local office, and I went through a long, elaborate, convoluted process of getting in, but that's how it started.
By that time, you had smuggled a dissident from behind the Iron Curtain.
Oh, I'd done that before I applied.
Exactly. Now, what's that story?
Well, after college, I thought, what am I going to do? Always struggling with the Conradian question. And since I loved my time in France, and business didn't especially interest me, which I remain to this day somewhat embarrassed to say, but it didn't. I thought, well, I know, I'll go back to France. I'll go to graduate school in France. That's useful, and it's French. So that's what I did.
You went back for the beautiful women.
I'm sorry?
You went back for the beautiful women, let's be honest.
Well, there are beautiful women everywhere, Atul. No, what was I talking about? Yeah,
You've already forgotten.
No. No. While I was an utterly destitute graduate student in Paris, I lived above, and this is what everyone should do in their lives. People who are more privileged and don't know the diversity of the human experience are truly impoverished. So I lived in what is called the combat zone, where the prostitutes do their work, above a transvestite bar. In those days, to be a transvestite was daring and different and illicit. As I entered my home, as I entered the unheated apartment in which I lived, it gets cold in Paris in the winter, I had to walk past there was a transvestite brothel. It was very specialized in France, the sex trade. One of whom, they're always the two same men at the door, dressed as women, one of whom was built like a bodybuilder, and the other of whom was about 2 meters tall. And they were very surly. They didn't like me. But I had to walk, and across the street was a pornographic cinema. It was a very seedy area.
Good education,
And
dare I
absolutely.
say so.
Oh, and the people there are just trying to get through the day like everybody else. They're answering the Conradian question too. And it truly was a wonderful experience, bizarre as it was. And so while there, I thought, I don't only want to know France, I want to know everything. I want to know every language, meet every person, understand every culture, go everywhere simultaneously. And that's what I've tried to do my whole life. And so it was during the Cold War. So that Europe is divided literally with a wall in many places. And I arranged to go behind the Iron Curtain. I tried to go to Albania, but they wouldn't even let me in the embassy. And then I tried to go to the Soviet Union, but they wouldn't give me a visa. But I did get a visa to go to what was then Czechoslovakia. At the darkest period for them, this was when the state was particularly harsh about any sort of dissent. And so I went there, and I helped it was quite clear that I was not Czech. As soon as I opened my mouth, by my shoes. You can always tell shoes are a big identifier for people who come from totalitarian societies, and I did not. And so because I was unusual in being a young male student in communist Czechoslovakia, I was notable. I was also followed, of course, but that's different. And so a young man my age approached me, and he said, could we take a walk in the park? And because even the wall, this is a quote, he said, even the walls can hear you, which was true. And so we walked in the park in a snowstorm, and he said, I have to leave. Will you help me, please? And I thought maybe I'm being set up, but I decided that he was sincere. And then another day there, I was approached by a young woman, and she said, could I buy you dinner? And I thought,
You thought it was because of your good looks.
I'm sorry?
You thought it was because of your good looks.
But
Initially, at least.
I agreed, and over dinner she said, I chose this place. It was a rowdy pub. There was a lot of noise all around.
Yeah.
So to hear each other, you had to sort of shout, but no one else could hear you. And she said, I chose this so I can talk to you, and so that it seems plausible. And I won't stay here. I'm Jewish. I'm one of the last 200 or 300 Jews in Czechoslovakia. My parents' careers have been destroyed because they are Jewish. They were scientists. And she was about my age. She was 23 or something like that. And I have to get out. So will you marry me?
Oh, la la.
Because only that way can I get out. And I remember, I said, oh my gosh, I don't really think I can marry you, but let's think of something else. So the something else that I came up with was I went back to Paris, and my roommate in Paris, who's a lifelong friend to this day, he's a Frenchman named François. François is a male name in French. But I said, François, we're going to have you as my wife, and you're going to be Françoise, which is a female's name. And so I wrote a letter to this young woman back in Prague saying, my wife Françoise and I pretended to be her uncle, would love to have you, niece so-and-so, come vacation with us to practice your French. And I understand travel is expensive, and I will guarantee the cost of your trip and your return to your parents in 2 weeks. And I formally am guaranteeing this. Visiting a relative for a finite period of time with a guarantee of return would increase the chances that she could get a visa. And then I was going to send that off, but my wife, François, had a really good idea. He said, no, he said, let's go down to the police station. And this is in Pigalle, where I was living, as I described it. So we went to the local police station, and the policeman on duty did not know us, but he was very open to a rich life that he had to deal with around him. And so we explained to him what we were going to do, and I was a little nervous, but my French friend said, no, he'll get this. And the French policeman on duty said, that is a fantastic idea. Give me that letter. And he took the letter and he got out all of the official stamps from the French police department, and he went, to make it an officially certified document by the French government. And I mailed it off.
The Americans wouldn't have done that. You're Puritans. You're Puritans.
No, as a Puritan WASP, we would have not done that. That was breaking the rules. And so that's how she got a visa to come out. There are many other adventures in her story. The fellow I helped get out by, computer chips were just beginning. It was the late 70s, early 80s. And so I went to a store, and you could buy them. They were in bins, and you could buy computer chips, and they weren't available behind the Iron Curtain. So I spent, as I remember, $75 in 1980 money, which would be $250 or something now, I suppose.
I have no idea.
About
quantitative easing makes me forget. What is the price of the dollar?
For me, having no money, it was a lot of money, but in the grand scheme of things, it wasn't much. But I then mailed them under 6 different names to 6 different addresses in 6 different disparate parts of Czechoslovakia that I had arranged with my Czech friend. He said, I'll make sure that my friends are aware that something might come, in the hope that one of them might slip through the censors and reach him. And then he said, I can sell the computer chips in the black market, and I can bribe someone to get a visa to go to Yugoslavia, which was easier in those days because it was socialist and not evil capitalist. And that's what happened. At least one of my packages reached its destination. And he was able to sell it for over a year's income, average person's income in Prague, and bribe an official. And he got a visa for a one-day excursion. And he went to, I forget the town in Yugoslavia, but he took a boat from the western end of Yugoslavia, now Slovenia, or in any event, the western part of what's Croatia today, to Venice. And he had 2 hours under a communist youth group guided tour of Trieste. Did I say Venice? Trieste, the city. And as soon as he got off the boat, he ran into the crowd, ran away. And he said his heart was pounding so loud that he couldn't hear anything. And he found a policeman, and he grabbed the policeman by the lapel, and he had learned 2 words of Italian. He said, asilo politico, political asylum, political asylum. And he was expecting this to, this is a big drama, the dramatic moment in this young man's life. But the policeman went, come with me. And it happened all the time. And he was granted political exile. And he then lived with my family for 7 years. He became my parents essentially adopted him as another son.
Brilliant. So you were already well on your way to becoming a spy before you became a spy. Shall we say you were showing prodigal signs of future genius, and you ended up at the height of the Cold War in Paris. And this is time the Soviet Union is around, very much around. It's considered very powerful. It's the 80s. What was it like to be a spy in Paris? Apart from, of course, clinking champagne glasses with beautiful women in low-cut dresses, which is what you did most of the time. But, what was the serious business like?
Yeah, well, I'll speak generically, but not about a specific place. A serious comment. I may not answer that question directly, but I can speak generally and accurately by fudging places and dates and so on. When we go through training, once you get hired to be, they're all different kinds of intelligence officer.
Really? I thought they were all like James Bond.
The most important two are the analysts and what we call in the CIA operations officer. They're very different species. And I was an operations officer. The operations officer is what all of us, think of when we think of a spy or the CIA or RAW. Operations officers are the individuals overseas whose job is, there are 5 parts to the job, as we learn in our courses. It's to recruit spies. And as the director of CIA, for some of the years I was working, a man named George Tenet put it pithily. He said the job of a CIA officer, of an intelligence officer, is to recruit spies and steal secrets. And that's the job. You get people to commit treason. You get people to betray their deepest public obligations, to break the law of their country. And how do you do that? It's very difficult. But there are 5 steps that I can talk about that we go through years of training to learn. So the job of an operations officer overseas is to spot a potential person you think could be a spy. You spot someone, you assess that person, you develop that person, you recruit that person, and then you handle that person. It's a 5-stage process that can happen in an hour, exceptionally unusual, but it's not like the movies. And it can take 10 years, 20. But that is the job. So how does one do that? There are as many ways to do that as there are leaves on a tree. It's all based on the individual circumstances and the individual, him or herself. Because we think, well, what motivates a person? And that's part of the job of assessing. We all have our hopes and our fears and what we like and how we are, our natural inclinations. This person is naturally nervous about any new circumstance. This person seeks to be new circumstances and is bored in routine. This person only is comfortable in routine. Different people. This person is greedy. This person is a womanizer. This person is deeply religious. This person is profoundly moral. So you look for vulnerabilities. And you think, well, Glenn obeys the law, loves his country, is not greedy, would not betray anyone. You think, well, what are you going to do about this guy? No vulnerabilities. That is largely true, but not entirely. Because perversely, there are circumstances when even one's strengths and positive attributes are vulnerabilities. Any of us can be pressured or manipulated. Any of us. Not any of us can be recruited. Most people cannot. Recruited means convinced or induced to commit espionage, to become a spy. Most people would not. But all of us can be manipulated. And that's the job. And it happens either by clinking a glass with an attractive woman at a cocktail party, or by walking down a dark alley, if the circumstance calls for that, or by singing in a choir at church, or by playing ice hockey. Whatever circumstance is called for, you all of a sudden will engage it.
And if it is an Indian IAS officer, you get their kids into Harvard.
Well, we can't help. No, I couldn't get someone into Harvard, but I could help them apply, and I could steer
and put in
them.
a word on the golf course.
No, no, that truly not. No one will believe me when I say this, but truly not. But I certainly could help them understand how to apply and increase their chances, but not by. I couldn't pull a string that way.
Oh,
I really couldn't.
what a pity. All right. You were in France, and France was and remains a left-leaning country, and you were the despised les Américains for a lot of the French. What was it like navigating France at the height of the Cold War? And you told me a story yesterday about gas. They were intending at that time in the 80s to import gas from the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So well, very curious about your perceptions and observations of France.
Yeah, well, that I can talk about because that's a diplomatic, that was part of my diplomatic life. So I could talk about diplomacy in a specific place, but not about espionage. So the episode that Atul is alluding to was in the mid to late 80s, so it's 40 years ago, almost.
No, over 30 years ago.
No, 40.
40 years
40.
ago. 40, yeah.
Shocking, I know. In any event, the issue at the time, and this will, nothing new under the sun kind of story, was that Western Europe, and France in particular, was seeking to reach a deal with the Soviet Union to build a gas pipeline from the Soviet Union to Western Europe to provide gas to Western Europe. And the French were pushing for that, thinking that it was a good thing to do to diversify their supply, to meet their demand and so on. And the United States position was that this was a bad idea because the Soviet Union was an adversary and it would give the Soviet Union tremendous leverage on an ally. And so my job as a diplomat, because I was also a diplomat, I truly was to represent the American position. But I was at a reception, and a counterpart of mine from the French government was there, and so you start to chat. And I said something like, gosh, I'm surprised that you're pursuing this gas pipeline. It's not a good idea. I don't know what I said, but something like that. And my counterpart, who was a female, I remember, looked at me just with condescension and disdain that this simple-minded, moralistic, imperialistic American would dare to tell anyone, in particular a French official, what to do. And so she looked at me and she said, more or less, the tone was, "You're an idiot and you offend me by your stupidity." She said, "Of course we're going to build it." And implied was, "You have nothing to say about it whatsoever." And then she turned around, turned her heels on me and walked away. And that was my, at that moment, particularly successful effort at diplomacy.
And so the French, you're saying, were problematic allies. The French were problematic allies during the Cold War, is what you're alluding to.
Yeah, I mean, they pride themselves on telling America where to go, but every country is a problematic ally. Every country pursues its own interests, as it should. I mean, the French shouldn't pursue American interests. They should pursue French interests.
All right. Two events shaped the world in the 80s or early 90s. On 9 November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Exactly 2 years later, starting 16 November 1991, the Soviet Union unraveled. What were you doing then, and how did America in general, and the CIA in particular, navigate those years?
Well, the primary mission of the intelligence community for 40 years had been the Cold War, to obtain intelligence on and counter the actions of the Soviet Union. So when the Cold War ended, it was almost as, for the intelligence community and the CIA, it was almost as though we had been leaning against a wall, figuratively, for 40 years, and then there was no more wall.
So you fell down with the Berlin Wall on your face.
And so the mission is no longer there, so what does one do? And then the Conradian question returns. You know, there was easily a 25% reduction in personnel. People were simply fired. I mean, the Cold War ended. Our mission was largely gone. That was a philosophical crisis point to define what is the purpose of the intelligence community with what was viewed as an existential challenge, whether it was or not is debatable, but what it was viewed as one, no longer existing. So that was sort of the larger reaction. At the moment, the specific moment, I had no particular role. I was an officer in Europe, but I happened to be...
Just like Vladimir Putin in Berlin.
Yeah, at the very moment that he was in East Berlin, I happened to be in Strasbourg, France. And it was a Sunday morning. And the only place that one could buy a newspaper early on a Sunday morning was at the train station. Everywhere else would be closed. So I drove from the hotel where I was staying, which was several kilometers, to the train station on this sort of wet morning. It wasn't raining, but it was a little wet, to buy the paper. And so I went up to the kiosk in the train station, and I paid for the paper, and I took it from the stand, and it was folded, and I put it under my arm, because I was fiddling with my rain jacket or a hat, or I don't know. And I walked out of the station, and as I was walking out of the station, I took it out from under my arm and unfolded the paper, and the headline said, I'm paraphrasing, "Berlin Wall falls." And I literally stopped. It was one of those moments that everyone has. We all have these, several in our lives, where you will remember perfectly what you were doing at a dramatic moment in your life. In the Cold War, it's something that nobody, I think, who hasn't lived it can quite appreciate. It shaped everything. You didn't have to be a CIA officer or obsessed with international relations or politics as I was. You could be a tennis player in Kansas, and it's still everybody. It shaped how we lived. It shaped the world, and it was very clearly one of the signal important turning moments in the century. And so I remember it was a dramatic moment.
And did you expect the Soviet Union to fall within 2 years?
Well, I had no insight on that, but I do remember another one of the stunning moments of my career happened 5 years before that, and this was in the early mid-'80s, and I was not a Soviet specialist. I did other things, but a Soviet expert in the CIA came to brief a number of us on developments in the Soviet Union. And we went into the secure meeting facility. It can't be bugged. It's called, the slang word in the CIA for that kind of facility is called the bubble. And you can't use electronic devices to listen, and so that's where you have secure conversations. And so we're sitting there, and this expert from Washington is briefing us, and he said, I remember there were maybe 6 of us in the little room. He said, in 5 years, and I don't know if it's possible to appreciate the drama, outlandishness of this comment, but he said to us, in 5 years, there will be no Soviet soldiers left in Central Europe. And at the time, the United States had 330,000 soldiers in Europe, and the Soviet Union had at least that many in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and so on, East Germany. And so when he said that, it was an absolutely stunning thing to say. And we were speechless. And I remember the meeting ended, and as we walked down the hall, having left that little room, I said to one of my colleagues, I said, what do you, we were always saying, what do you think about that? And he said, it's hard to believe, it's hard to imagine. And he was wrong. He missed it by 2 years. He said that in 1987, and it was not until 1994 that the last Soviet soldier left. So he was shockingly accurate in his understanding of the dynamics going on at the time.
Excellent. On that note, thank you very much, Glenn. It's been a pleasure. It's an honor. Welcome to IIT Gandhinagar again, and we'll now take you for dinner.
Well, that sounds good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.